Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Trident University Marketing Specialist Daniel Sloan, and we're excited to be bringing you today's Culture of Research and Education webinar. The C.O.R.E webinar series is designed to provide faculty, students, and alumni an opportunity to share their research and scholarship with the Trident community. By fostering a culture of professional development and idea exchange, participants will have access to a valuable forum for lifelong learning. This university-wide effort is coordinated by Trident's Doctoral Studies directors. Just a few notes before we begin today's session. You're welcome to ask questions and share your experiences with today's subject matter at any time. We will have a Q&A session at the end of all of our presentations today, and you can submit your questions and comments on the control panel in the question box, which can be found about halfway down, and that's on the right-hand side of your screen. If that does not work for you, or if you have any technical difficulties, you can email me directly at daniel.sloan@trident.edu. This webinar will be recorded, and all attendees will receive a link to this webinar and a copy of the slides by early next week. Today's session will be hosted by Dr. Indira Guzman, Doctoral Studies Director in Trident's Glenn R. Jones College of Business. Dr. Guzman Dr. Guzman is Doctoral Studies Director and a Professor of IT Management. She has been a faculty member and dissertation mentor at Trident since 2006. Her research has been published in over 50 academic outlets. Welcome, Dr. Guzman, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for your introduction and for helping us organize this panel. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar entitled Structural Equation Modeling for Researchers. As you may know, the core webinars at Trident are organized by the Doctoral Studies Director, and we take turns every quarter. So this quarter, it's the turn of the College of Business, and we decided to discuss another important topic for all our doctoral students. As you know, doctoral dissertations, especially in the College of Business, are generally quantitative dissertations where students conduct multivariate analysis taking into account several factors. And just to give you an example, out of the 12 approved dissertations in the last year in the PhD and Business Administration program, all had quantitative components, and 10 of them used structural equation modeling. This topic, the selection of the statistical tool, is a major consideration. As a researcher, we all need to make the most appropriate choice to increase the quality and rigor of the research. So in this panel, in today's webinar, we are going to discuss the structural equation modeling role for researchers and why is this topic important for doctoral students. As I said, this is a panel format, and we have in our panelists today are three experienced researchers, and we are honored to have their participation today. And I really appreciate the three of them who kindly agreed to share their experience with the structural equation modeling. First, we're gonna have the presentation from Dr. Eveland, who has taught and served as dissertation chair for several dissertations for many doctoral students. Then we're gonna have Dr. Chad Lunsford, who used Amos in his dissertation, and then Dr. Angeles, who used the SMART PLS in his dissertation. Again, I am very happy to have the three of them here today as panelists, and we are going to start with Dr. Eveland. Let me tell you a little bit of the background of Dr. Eveland. As I said, we are really honored with his presence today. Dr. Eveland has over 30 years of academic experience in different universities, over 65 years of 65 published publications in journals and other outlets in organizational behavior and technology and policy. Over 7 years as policy analyst, program manager at the National Science Foundation, and more than 15 years of experience as consultant to the RAND Corporation. Dr. Eveland has a extensive experience consulting students, advising, tutoring, mentoring doctoral students. It's a real honor for us to have him in this panel and to learn from his experiences. Dr. Eveland, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dr. Guzman. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I hope we'll be able to provide some enlightenment to those of you attending about the circumstances under which this is or is not an appropriate technique for you. I first encountered structural equation modeling back in the early 1970s when I was in graduate school. The people on the third floor of the Institute for Social Research building at the University of Michigan were doing something called LISREL, which sounded very interesting. I took a couple of short courses in the topic, but I never really used it particularly because it didn't fit the kind of data that I was working with. About 1998, I first began to teach the topic in relation to some quantitative courses I was doing. It was not until the middle 2000s that I actually applied it in my own research and developed it as a teaching tool for the program that we had at Trident. I finally wound up publishing a paper that involved the application of SEM only until in 2012. It is therefore a relatively new kind of topic, but it's certainly something that's been extensively applied. It's had a kind of explosive growth since then. I've supervised a lot of students doing work with dissertation work with this since then, and it's certainly is a very widely applied kind of technique and one that finds a lot of application in the kind of dissertations that students do at Trident. The question of when we want to use it is obviously a judgment call. Basically, the SEM is primarily a program for use with what we call latent variables. That is, variables that are representations of complex constructs where we have multiple measurements involved in assessing them, and where there's no direct way of measuring the concept by itself. Wherever we have hypotheses that involve latent variable relationships, we can apply this kind of technique as long as the other kind of basic assumptions are satisfied. Like any statistical technique, SEM has assumptions, and different techniques have different varieties of assumptions, but all of them require certain properties in the data. We need to be using interval scales, for example. Many of them require that we have relatively normally distributed variables, although there are some exceptions to that. It's very useful when we can, because it gives us an opportunity to apply what we call the measurement model and the structural model simultaneously. That is, the measurement model is the way in which we represent the latent variable constructs. The structural model is the relationships among those latent variable constructs. Whenever we're going to use it, we better know what we're doing. And that's what I mean here when we say we need to invest time and energy in doing it. You have to know what you're doing, otherwise it's going to be kind of frustrating and not very helpful. It is not simply just the easiest way to sweep all your data into one large analysis, although it does have that function. But it is something that needs some careful analysis, and you need to be sure that the data are really appropriate to the kind of problem that you're dealing with. What else could we do? Well, structural equation modeling is essentially a combination of what we call confirmatory factor analysis, that is the structure of the latent variables, and that's the measurement model, and the old tradition called path analysis, which is the relationships among those variables, and that's what we call the structural modeling. Each of these can be done separately. They can be done with SPSS or any variety of other kinds of statistical routines. Usually, various varieties of general linear modeling are what we would use as alternatives, things like multiple regression, generalized least squares, two-stage least squares, a variety of kinds of alternatives of regression techniques. There are two distinctly different varieties of structural equation modeling that you need to be aware of. One is what we call covariance-based techniques. These are techniques like Amos and LISREL. These generally are a little more stringent in terms of the kind of assumptions that they require. They tend to use maximum likelihood estimation rather than ordinary regression, they tend to be more concentrated on assessment of fit of the overall model than some other varieties. The so-called variance-based SEM is primarily partial least squares, although there's some variations on that too. These are techniques that are adapted primarily to looking at the data sets that we have. They concentrate on analyzing the properties of the data. We assess the fit by using things that we call bootstrapping, which is essentially a way of assessing how a particular model fits a particular set of data that we have. The data themselves define the circumstances under which this can be used. Both of these techniques are appropriate. Different journals like different kinds of techniques, different fields like different kinds of techniques. There are reasons why we should choose one versus the other, and some of that we'll go into a little bit later on. Over the years, the main problem that we've seen is that people think they know what they're doing. Obviously, the people who we have here today know what they're doing and have done so very effectively. But it does take some real attention to, and if you don't know what you're doing, you can get very confused, because like any technique, any statistical technique, these kinds of programs that do these assessments generate enormous quantities of information, large quantities of numbers, different kinds of coefficients, different kinds of relationships, and unless you know what you're doing, it's very easy to get swamped by the data. If you don't understand what the assumptions are that go into your data, then you're going to be very confused trying to explain it. It is very awkward when you get to trying to defend a dissertation proposal or a dissertation even, and it turns out you don't understand what you're doing. So it is really important to be able to explain clearly what the technique is doing, and it doesn't mean you have to be a mathematician, it doesn't mean you have to understand all of the mechanics that go into it, but it does mean you have to be able to interpret the output in a reasonable kind of fashion. There is also tends to be the assumption that other people understand this in the same way that you do. And since if you put quite a lot of energy into learning this, you realize other people, for the most part, haven't. So you need to be able to explain clearly what's being generated and what it means in order to be able to apply this to usefully to your own kind of research. So I think that's basically where we are, and the main issue that I would leave you with is it's a very useful set of techniques, but you have to know what you're doing and be able and willing to invest the energy in doing it. Thank you, and we'll answer a question later on if you need to.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eveland, for the advice, the recommendations, and the overall introduction to the topic. We're going to go ahead and continue with Dr. Chant Lunsford. Dr. Lunsford finished his dissertation and the PhD program here at Trident University, and his dissertation was entitled "The Role of Voice in the Work of Top Management Teams in the U.S. Navy." Dr. Lunsford is, as I said, a graduate from Trident University. He is currently a senior enlisted leader serving as a Commander Master Chief in the United States Navy, and he's currently assigned to the Pacific Fleet Leadership and Ethical Training Team, where he travels throughout the Pacific Fleet teaching leadership and ethics to various commands. So we're very happy to have him here share his experience with structural equation modeling for other doctoral students. Please go ahead, Dr. Lunsford.
Thank you, Dr. Guzman. So as Dr. Guzman said, I did a study on Navy leadership, and specifically I was looking to further voice in top management teams, and I was looking for to establish a relationship or a correlation that hadn't previously been found, specifically around top leadership cohesion, voice, job satisfaction, and trust. I did use exchange theory as my overall foundation, and I developed a total of 6 hypotheses to test. My study itself collected a total of 516 cases using an online survey method out of a total of 1,800 that were possible, giving me a rating of about 21% return rate, which is actually pretty decent. For mine, I needed an actual 279 cases, and you'll be able to see here shortly in a table the 6 hypotheses. Although my model itself did not fit the data, I was able to look at the individual cases and the individual relationships and paths, if you will, to see which ones were supported, and all except for hypothesis 6 were supported. Hypothesis 4 partially supported, and if you had questions on it, we could talk through that. But that's what I was able to do. So why did I actually use SEM for mine? The easy answer is it's fast. You can run individual tests using multiple regression, or you can build one model and literally test everything within minutes. It does allow you to test multiple variables. I already talked a little bit about goodness of fit, which is the side that I wanted to see as well. And then once goodness of fit failed for me, then I went to the individual paths to find out if there were any relationships that I could still discuss. I did use a mediated method, so this does also allow for bootstrapping, and it tests the entire model and relationship at one time instead of each individual path or each individual leg, as we've learned with the Kenny method. And then for this model, it also allows you to control for measurement error, and it's much, much more flexible. So the picture you're looking at on the left-hand side is the actual toolbar itself. So that's your graphic user interface. You simply just plug your variables in depending on what it is you're trying to build. This is already working off your database, and you can see once you build the model, it's easy because you can simply just add links, subtract links based on what theory is telling you. If you notice up top in the EV scale, EV1 is missing, and then to the left on the TL scale, TL6 is missing, and that was when I was doing my reliability and my validity. Those specific items didn't support, they didn't make the scales better. By removing them actually increased the scale, so it was very easy to test and validate. So some of the advantages, you can see, you can just move the links. So once you run the first test and you get your modification indices, then they'll suggest if you move this link or remove this link or add this link, it's going to make your model better by this percentage. So you go back to your theory says, yes, that's good. Instead of trying to rebuild an entire model, you can just simply move those links as it's suggested and then hit run, and you get the data again to tell you if in fact it does support theory or not. We've already talked about running individual tests. The graphic user interface for me is simple. I'm a visual person, so being able to look at my model visually was extremely helpful. For me also, this was an add-on to SPSS, meaning my data was already there. I didn't have to export it out to another database, so the chance of corrupting was minimized. And then for mine, my data ended up being non-normal. So Dr. Eveland talked earlier, for SEM, one of the things we have to satisfy as an assumption is normalized data. In my case, my data for my Likert scales became extremely skewed, and I was able to use bootstrapping within Amos to correct for it. Still did not correct the fit for me. So the disadvantages, initially, it's challenging to understand. When you first hit go and you get a data output or a text output, if you will, to find all the different tables, to find where different things are being reported and what they're calling it is a little bit different, and it can be a little bit overwhelming. If you were to code specific script, like you wanted it to run a specific pattern multiple times, to run that script can be a little bit challenging. But on the good side of it is there's other tools within bootstrapping to let you do it without having to use a script. And then the initial setup and drawing what shape for what link, you get a lot of errors if you're not used to it, and understanding what those errors mean and what mistakes you're actually using can be challenging to figure out. My advice, first and foremost, make a master copy of your data set, put it away somewhere, and don't touch it for any analysis. Use it only to refresh a database if for some reason you got corrupt. The reason is you can work for weeks or months and figure out somewhere along the line you messed something up and you don't know about it. Now you're at the tail end of a presentation for your dissertation, and your data is actually wrong and you don't know where it came from. As far as learning how to use the tool, it's not hard to learn. If you don't invest the time, it is a challenge, but literally in about a day, maybe a solid weekend for some folks, there's many great YouTube videos out there that will walk you through it with a live database, so that you can kind of mimic what they're doing and learn how to use it. And then as you're moving through your model, after you build your model, keep very good copy and control. Label everything. What did you do? What did you move? Why did you move that one link? Because like I said, you could get to where you're now making your proposal and you don't understand what you did 2 weeks ago, but now the data says, hey, this is good. Again, which is probably not the right way to do business. You want to let the data speak for itself based in theory versus trying to force your data to prove what you're looking at. And you can help solve all that by just keeping good notes. Again, if you have any questions as we get to the end of this, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Lunsford, and thank you especially for the emphasis on theory. That's very important for PhD dissertations and for the practical advice for our doctoral students. We're gonna go ahead and switch to Dr. Jose Angeles. He's our next presenter. Dr. Angeles also completed his PhD in business administration with a concentration in information systems here at Trident, but he did so already 2 or 3 years ago, and but he has been already working with doctoral students as well, and now he's teaching a class here at Trident, RES 610. A research methods class in the PhD program. Dr. Angeles has extensive expertise in the IT systems development, implementations, and operation, more than 36 years of work experience in the IT field, 11 years active duty Air Force, and 17 as Air Force Reserve. So his experience is extensive in the IT field. He's currently serving as a deputy CIO for a sub-unified Department of Defense command, and where he is responsible for 20 million year IT budget and overseeing operations and training for more than 65 personnel. So we're very happy again to have Dr. Angeles too discussing and letting us know about his experience with the structural equation modeling and his experience as well teaching it in our program. Please go ahead, Dr. Angeles.
Well, thank you, Dr. Guzman. So I'm going to talk about, we'll start off talking about my experiences. It was first encountered in the PhD program back in 2010. And then I decided to use that in my dissertation in 2016 because it basically fit the type of model that I had. And I'll talk about that in the upcoming slides. I also teach this tool as well as other tools and help students compare the different tools in the RES 610 that's currently offered at Trident University. So the next we'll talk about when is SEM recommended. So we recommend the use of structural equation modeling when we have a model that's focused on prediction. We're trying to get variables that predict other variables, not group differences or just not general relationships like that would normally be tested with correlation. For when our main variables are continuous or interval and not just of 2 or 3 levels. When we have complex models, have several stages of mediation or moderation or combinations thereof. Most importantly, when our variables are multidimensional, in other words, they're comprised of the integration of other variables which are directly measured. And then next, when variables have formative indicators or formative subdimensions. In other words, the indicators are not reflections of the variable, but they integrate to form or create the variable. And then finally, when we have a need to assess alternate models in a short period of time. So what are some alternatives to structural equation modeling? Well, in most cases, first-generation regression tools can be used to test the similar models or the same models in structural equation modeling. But you must realize that you have to transform the raw data first into scales. In other words, if you have reflective variable with 4 or 5 reflective indicators, these have to be integrated, usually averaged. And if you have formative indicators, there are other methods to create a scale for use in regression. And so, again, depending on the type of variables you have to be able to understand how to correctly transform that data. So one of the things I'd like to focus on is the kind of issues that I've seen students or other people experiencing. First and foremost, it's not understanding the stages or the steps required for data analysis and why each step is accomplished. The end goal of our research is to reach statistical conclusion validity. And there's 3 major steps to that. First is to clean the data by removing bad data or adding missing data to our data set. And the next is several steps for data validity to ensure we're correctly measuring the variables. And finally, it's to test the relationships between the variables. That's how this hypothesis is supported. So you really can't move on from one step to the next without successfully completing the predecessors. And then, of course, not understanding which tools are used for those specific steps, and we'll go over that in the following slides. And then not understanding that different tools have evolved their own terms. For example, if we use the regression tools, you might see the term beta weight. If you use structural equation modeling, the various tools sometimes use the term path coefficient. This is just an evolution of like concepts that each of the tools have evolved. So in my dissertation, I created a new construct. First and foremost, I was sort of intrigued by the series of models related to the use of IT. The models there are several models that have been developed over the past 15 years that predict how well users. Sorry, can you go back one? There are several models that have been developed over the last 15 years that can predict how well individuals perceive their use of information technology. But I realized early that should only be dependent on how well they know the business process that information technology is being used for. So I created a variable called perceived business process knowledge, which would integrate into information technology use models. Now, I theoretically defended that this second order construct required 5 or 6 subdimensions. Each of those would be the ones that would be measured. And because I had formative subdimensions and a multidimensional variable, I needed to use structural equation modeling. I decided to use a smart PLS because at the time it was the easiest one, the one I understood the most. If we move on now. So I mentioned earlier the steps required to assess a model. There are first 2 areas for the measurement model assessment are reliability and validity, and each of them have 2 components. For reliability, we're looking at indicator reliability. How well does a single indicator measure a variable? In internal consistency reliability, how well do all the indicators measure a variable? And you can do the same function of the same steps with both SPSS and Smart PLS. It's just that each of those tools has slightly different ways of doing it. The same thing with validity, convergent validity. Do the indicators represent the same construct? And discriminant validity. Do the indicators for different constructs only align with their own? And again, each of those tools, SPSS and Smart PLS, have their own ways of doing that, and statistics used to assess those. So I use Smart PLS, and you can see here that I had the entire model loaded at once. I had the subdimensions forming the second order focal construct, and then it should have been related to other variables that you see on the far right. And I was quickly able to assess which indicators were not loading well on their variables to eliminate them, and those are the ones I've circled in red. And then for the indicator reliability, this is another output of SPSS. You can see in the first column that the items are loading very strongly, much greater than 0.7 on each of the variables they're associated with. And of course, the p-values are basically 0 for each of those items. Moving on to for internal consistency reliability, SPSS has two mechanisms. The one Cronbach alpha that most of the students are aware of, because it's the same mechanism used in the SPSS, but there's another measure also called composite reliability that is available in SPSS. For convergent and discriminant validity, this is the table that is output from SPSS, and then the statistic used to assess them. Once we've tested that the indicators are properly measuring the variables, we can now look at relationships between variables. And so there's basically three areas we look for: explanatory power, that's at the variable itself, and then between variables, it's the effect size and predicted behavior. And you can see here that SPSS and SMART-PLS have mechanisms to do that. Some of them have to be manually calculated if you use SPSS. Other ones are automatically calculated in SMART-PLS. And then there's new measures of predictive behavior that have only become available since the structural equation modeling tools have evolved. So in my dissertation, now that the measurement model was satisfied, now I'm looking at the relationship between the focal construct and the other variables that it should be related to. And this is how I chose to depict it. So I have the path coefficients and effect size. The effect size is on the top of the line, and the path coefficients are below the line. All the p-values were 0.000, so on all the paths. And we see that r squared is on the variable itself. So here's the advice, and I think Dr. Eveland gave similar. Make sure you understand which tool is used for which validity, data analysis, which statistic is used to report that given validity. Now, most importantly, as you come across articles related to the variables you're studying, pay attention to the tools they use and the means that they displayed those results. If some of the variables that you're going to test have been tested mostly with regression in the past, well, maybe that's the way to go. If you see those variables being tested more recently using structural equation modeling and one or other structural equation modeling tools, you may want to lean toward those tools. In the end, though, it's the tool you're most comfortable with that you can defend and articulate how you got the results. Now, most important, it's that not all hypotheses are quantitative, some are qualitative, which means that they have to be demonstrated via presentation of an argument or defense. And so as an example, in my dissertation, which is actually publicly available, I had 3 main hypotheses, but there were over 15 or so sub-hypotheses, and a number of those were qualitatively defended. And I think that's all I have. We can move on to question and answer now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Angeles. We're going to go ahead and discuss and come up with conclusions. I really appreciate the table that you showed us that I hope the students can see and compare their options and make decisions. Dr. Eveland, did you have any additional words to wrap up the discussion?
Not particularly. I think that the issues have been raised very effectively. I would reiterate the observation that both Dr. Lunsford and Dr. Angeles made, and that is that you need to keep very careful records of what it is that you're doing in any analysis. Keeping an analysis log is always a good idea, and because it's sometimes hard to remember what it is that you've done, and it's hard to remember sometimes how you've created variables, put them together in different kinds of ways. So keeping a very careful record of what you do is always important for any kind of analysis that you do. I think we've discussed a variety of the circumstances under which this is appropriate and not appropriate. I think it's certainly something to discuss with your chair and with other members of your committee as you develop your ideas.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Okay. Let's move on to the Q&A. And the person in the audience is typing right now. Could you mute your mic, please? Be appreciated. Thank you. We do have a few questions, and as a reminder, if you want anything answered or you have any advice or comments to share with the audience, you can submit them by the question box on the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. And first question we have, this one is for Dr. Lunsford, and it is one of our attendees enjoys Amos, but hasn't found a solution for a Mac. Do you have any advice for him?
No, actually, but I will look into it. I use PC. I do know my wife is a Mac user, and on a Mac you can run an emulator that will allow you to run all PC programs on a Mac. So that's what I would first go into, is to see if there's a PC emulator software that you can run, and then it would allow you to convert. Outside of that, I don't know of a direct conversion, but I will look into it.
I too am a Mac person, and some advice for you is that for a while I had a computer where it was basically split off, or it had both operating systems, and I could just flip back and forth if I needed to use something for PC only. Next question. This one is for you, Dr. Angeles. Why did you use both Cronbach alpha and composite reliability, and why does the output differ slightly between the two?
So I'll answer the second part first. The underlying mathematics behind the two measures is different, and the truth is I'm not sure what each one actually represents. I know the Cronbach alpha is basically constantly comparing each of the individual indicators through a very specific algorithm, but how the other mechanism does it, I'm not sure, and I reported both because they were both available, and I was using a guidebook on how to report results using Smart PLS, and it just suggested reporting that. So.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Angeles. And question for Dr. Eveland. You really, in your closing comments, you really stressed the need to detail and document everything. Do you have any further advice on ways to do it, or are there any tutorials online to help students out with this?
I think probably the most effective one is the one you learned somewhere back in first grade, which is writing with one of these things. That's there are plenty of ways you can automate your process, if you like, keeping online records. But I've never found anything much more effective than simply writing things down carefully. The advantage of that is that it provides then a sort of linear line of what you've done, and if you can remember when you did something, you can find what you need to find. Everybody has slightly different ways of keeping track of their own information, and I suspect you can find the one that works for you. It's the simplest one that works that you can possibly manage. Don't log yourself down with too much software if you can help it. There is no technical solution to this problem.
Thank you. And we actually have one more question. And if you do want your question answered, there's still time to get it in. This question is for Dr. Lunsford. You mentioned some YouTube videos. Do you have any advice on where to find those and which ones would be best?
Yes, sir. So I actually spent quite a bit of time on YouTube. Started off with just Google searches, bootstrapping and AMOS and different things like that. What I found, there's a gentleman by the name of Mike Crowson, C-R-O-W-S-O-N. He has an entire library of YouTube videos he's done for all of SPSS, AMOS, SEM. Very specific, gives you a tutorial database to kind of learn along with them, and really does a very good job for me explaining it at the lowest level to where it was very easy to understand what I was looking for. I could click along with them. I think we could probably, I can shoot over a link for you, the main one that I use for bootstrapping. But the guy's name is Mike Crowson. And once you get to him on YouTube, he's got just an entire database of it. It's amazing.
Yeah, and you said that last name was spelled C-R-O-W-S-E-N?
S-O-N, I'm sorry.
S-O-N, okay. That could have been my mistake as well. But yeah, we'll type it out and we'll put the information out to everyone in the audience. We do have one more question, and this one is actually for everyone. And so I'm going to start with Dr. Angelis, then we'll go to Dr. Eveland, then Dr. Lunsford. And question, Dr. Angelis, did you start working with a certain tool and realize you needed to use a different tool based on your data?
No, actually, I knew up front that I was going to use Smart PLS. So when I built my model, I had a choice of several tools to use, but I created I simulated the data by creating a data set using a little tool that I developed. I kind of envisioned what it should look like for every indicator, and how much skewness it would have, and how normal it should be or shouldn't be, and figured out how to introduce all kinds of error in it and made a large data set. And then I just decided to see how it would work using Smart PLS, and then I tried it with also with SPSS regression, and it just became easier to do it with Smart PLS. That's kind of how I ended up with it. Honestly, I tried AMOS up front, but there was a couple of the mechanisms that are required, such as a setting error into each of the variables that I really didn't understand the purpose of and why at the time, and I didn't want to start using a tool that I didn't fully understand. So in the end, SPSS was just the easiest tool that met my requirements for multidimensional variables and so forth. So
I'd agree. I think the basically what you need to do is look at your data and determine whether your data fit more closely the assumptions of one kind of technique versus another. I certainly think the idea of simulating data is very good. There's some very useful tools for doing this. There's one program where you can just plug in means and standard deviations and a correlation matrix, and it will generate for you a data set with as many cases as you like that display those properties. It's kind of handy for a lot of purposes. But it is most important to understand what your data are and what they're telling you. I've always applied what I call Eveland's data principle, which is treat your data as you would wish to be treated if you were a datum. That implies that you understand your data properties and can adapt well to the kind of proper techniques, the requirements of the techniques you're using.
My exposure is probably like most students when they were going through. Dr. Eveland had a series of assignments where you would build a data set, try to match the data, and those were my research classes that I went on. That was my first exposure to SPSS. I hadn't used it prior to that, and as I started working towards my dissertation, I did notice that SEM was going to be the required tool, and it wasn't actually what I initially proposed, and it was my entire committee that said through my chairman, hey, you're using very antiquated tools. You're trying to solve a problem on last year's technology. You really need to get into SEM. You really need to pick a tool, and you need to add bootstrapping. When I found that out, that's what got me into Amos, because I had a class where I had used it once or twice, did a little more research on it. I spent a couple weeks into YouTube videos to try to learn more about it, and then I was able to come back with theory why it supported my data, and it was the appropriate tool to use. And then after that, I just learned how to use it, and it was quite easy for me.
Great. Thank you, everyone. And that wraps up our questions, but we do have a few comments and advice from the audience. And, in the beginning, when we talk about, the C.O.R.E and the Trident research community, this is exactly what we're talking about. So thank you, everyone, for sharing this. First, Smart PLS does work on Mac if that's something that you are considering. And we had someone else who wanted to share about his favorite YouTube tutorials called Gaskin's, GASKIN, Stat Wiki. And last point, we were talking about journaling and keeping track of things, but research. One of our attendees suggests looking into research journaling because, as he says, it's extremely important when you go back years later and try to explain or replicate your procedures. So thank you, everyone, for contributing, and going to hand things off to Dr. Guzman to close us out today.
Yeah, thank you everyone for sharing your experiences. I think it's good to have this kind of panel to discuss experiences and get some advice for others. I mean, it's all about building knowledge and being able to learn from others' experience to get better at and add rigor to our research in our dissertations. So it's time now to, I know that our webinar is supposed to be short, so we're gonna continue with, I'm gonna pass on Daniel to tell us more about the next webinars, but I want to thank again the panelists today, Drs. Lunsford, Angeles, and Dr. Eveland, who has the extensive experience, and we are, as I said, we're planning another webinars that will help doctoral students. Thank you everyone for attending, and please let us know if you have questions. In the list below, you can see the next C.O.R.E webinars. We're going to have one on writing strategies for doctoral research. Again, that is very important for our students. And then 2 other webinars organized by the College of Education, developing a practitioner-oriented dissertation study. That's more for the EDD and DBA programs. And finally, another one on navigating student dissertation chair relationships. So we look forward to seeing you attending our C.O.R.E webinars, and have a wonderful rest of the day.